This map of Upper Lusatia outlines a region that sat directly on a geopolitical fault line at the dawn of the 17th century. To the west lay rigid Lutheran orthodoxy, while to the south, Calvinist unrest simmered across Bohemia. It was here, in the border town of Görlitz, that Jacob Boehme made a modest living. He was not a trained theologian or a prominent academic. He was an uneducated peasant who had been apprenticed as a shoemaker at 14, a man burdened by frail health and intense recurring bouts of melancholy. His despair was rooted in a question that challenged the very core of his faith. If the universe was created by a benevolent, all-powerful God, why was it saturated with such profound cruelty and suffering? The violent religious friction tearing across Europe provided a grim external context for Boehme's own internal search. He was an artisan trying to reconcile the promise of divine goodness with the reality of a world at war with itself. In 1600, while sitting in his room, Boehme's attention was caught by a beam of sunlight striking the reflective surface of a simple pewter dish. The flash sent him into an ecstatic trance. He later reported that, in 15 minutes, he saw through the physical clutter of his room into the hidden spiritual structure of the world, perceiving what he called the signatures of all created things. From this experience, Boehme concluded that the divine was not a distant, detached observer. Instead, he saw the Creator as intimately entangled within the physical reality of nature. In 17th century Germany, these were not merely private thoughts. For an uneducated peasant to claim a personal, direct line to cosmic truth was a direct challenge to the authority of the Church, and a potentially fatal one. 12 years passed before Boehme recorded his vision. The result was Aurora, a sprawling manuscript he wrote primarily to clarify his own thoughts. When a visiting nobleman had the manuscript copied and circulated, it eventually reached Gregorius Richter, the chief pastor of Görlitz. Richter was a defender of strict orthodoxy and immediately denounced the cobbler's work as heretical from the pulpit. The town council took swift action. Boehme was briefly banished and then presented with an ultimatum. He would be allowed to remain with his family only if he surrendered his writing and agreed to remain silent forever. Boehme accepted the bargain and returned to his shoemaking trade, but the confrontation had clarified his position. The Church's attempt to suppress his ideas only confirmed the tension between institutional authority and his personal experience of the divine. For 7 years, he kept his promise. He built a successful business in the linen and wool trade, traveling to markets in Prague and Leipzig, while continuing to refine his ideas in private. In 1619, encouraged by a growing circle of secret supporters, Boehme broke his silence. He produced a steady stream of sophisticated texts that moved beyond simple mysticism and into complex philosophical inquiry. His most significant concept was the Ungrund, a bottomless, dark nothingness prior to all things. Out of this abyss emerged a fundamental division, the yes and no. The universe is sustained by opposing forces, divine love and light defined against divine wrath and dark fire. As this passage shows, Boehme moved away from the idea of creation out of an absolute void. Instead, he proposed that physical reality was generated from the divine's own essence, driven by an inherent craving to be manifest and known. This philosophical system echoed the conditions of Boehme's own life. His texts posit that light can only be revealed through its opposite, just as his own most complex ideas were articulated in direct reaction to years of enforced silence and institutional pressure. The publication of The Way to Christ caused a final violent backlash. Boehme's home was attacked by an angry mob, and the town magistrates officially forced him into exile once more. He sought refuge in Dresden, where he was examined by the Elector of Saxony's top theologians. They subjected him to an intense interrogation, but were ultimately struck by the sophistication of his answers, refusing to issue a formal condemnation. An artisan with no formal academic training had successfully navigated a high-level theological trial, holding his own against the most prominent institutional thinkers of his day. Boehme died in 1624, listening to what he described as celestial music. The local clergy remained hostile to the end. After his burial, a crowd destroyed the cross placed on his grave by his friends. Following his death, his followers smuggled the outlawed manuscripts across the border to Amsterdam. It was here that his writings were finally printed, initiating an intellectual chain reaction that spread across Europe.
These texts centered on a concept Boehme called the ungrund. He described a groundless abyss, a dark, irrational void existing before time or physical manifestation. From this void, creation emerged through the friction of opposing forces, a cosmic yes and no crashing together, creating the energy necessary for the universe to reveal itself. This vision of a dualistic abyss acted as a catalyst, offering later generations a new way to categorize the tension between nothingness and existence. By the 1640s, Boehme's manuscripts reached England. His focus on radical interiority, the idea that the divine is found within the self rather than in institutions, fueled a wave of dissent against the established church. These ideas directly influenced the formation of the Quakers and Jane Lee's Philadelphian Society, groups that sought a direct personal experience of the divine abyss. Even the English monarchy and the scientific elite were watching. Translations of Boehme's Answers to 40 Questions circulated among the era's most prominent scholars. Isaac Newton was among those who studied Boehme. Records suggest he integrated Boehme's alchemical insights into his own early inquiries into the forces that govern the physical world. Later, William Blake adopted Boehme's dialectic of the yes and no. He translated the struggle of opposing forces within the abyss into his famous doctrine of contraries, asserting that progression is impossible without opposition. In England, Boehme's abyss provided a bridge between mystical experience and empirical inquiry, suggesting that the same laws governed both the soul and the stars. Around 1800, the manuscripts returned to Germany. This time, they were not smuggled into cobbler shops, but integrated into the academic curriculum of the German idealists. Hegel realized that Boehme's intuition of the universe mirrored his own thinking. He saw the shoemaker's mystical struggle as a precursor to his own dialectical system of logic. Hegel explicitly acknowledged this debt, referring to Jacob Boehme as the first German philosopher. Hegel reinterpreted Boehme's divinity as a dynamic process. In this view, the absolute achieves self-knowledge only by moving through the experience of finite human consciousness. Friedrich Schelling also utilized the ungrund, using the concept of a pre-rational, dark depth to explain the origin of human freedom and the possibility of evil. German philosophy successfully secularized Boehme's ecstatic visions, turning them into a formal framework for understanding the evolution of the absolute. When Boehme's manuscripts moved into Russia, they encountered a landscape of radical mysticism and state-sanctioned violence. In 1689, Korinnes Kuhlmann was executed in Red Square for preaching Boehme's visions, marking a tragic chapter in the shoemaker's Eastern legacy. Later Russian thinkers, like Nikolai Berdyaev, adopted the ungrund as mnemonic freedom, a type of liberty that exists even before the creation of God. This interpretation transformed the abyss into a philosophy of existential tragedy. It suggested that humans are forced to create their own meaning and order out of a primal void. In the East, the ungrund was recognized as the ultimate requirement for human creativity and the ability to act within history. In the 20th century, the core of Boehme's dualistic architecture remained visible in several modern worldviews. Carl Jung used Boehme's dualities to map the human psyche. He saw this shadow as an internal abyss and argued that the integration of these opposing forces was necessary for personal growth. Paul Tillich later recontextualized the abyss for modern theology, describing a ground of being that resides beneath all physical and spiritual existence. Boehme's cosmology even anticipated elements of modern physics. He envisioned the universe expanding violently out of a dark void, triggered by a sudden flash of light. He described this as the Angstrad, or wheel of anguish, a rotational friction that bears a resemblance to modern theories of the Big Bang and non-equilibrium thermodynamics. Modern science often mirrors Boehme's intuition. Instead of a static machine, researchers describe a dynamic system sustained by friction and constant change. Boehme identified the abyss as the source of all movement. In his cosmology, darkness and opposition are the primary ingredients for the birth of light.